start time. So we really appreciate everyone being here today. As you know, this is part of our Experiencing DEI series. And I have the great privilege of introducing our current chair of the North Dallas Chamber of Commerce, and that's Tina Young, who is the founder and CEO of MarketWave. So Tina, do you want to take over the program?
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Hi, everyone. Thank you for prioritizing this today on your calendar and being on the screen with us. Really excited about today's program. And I know many of you were able to attend the first program in this series, which was back in June. So June 23rd, we kicked this off. We are calling it Experiencing DEI because, diversity, equity, and inclusion is high on the agenda and in conversations right now within your businesses, but we really want to bring context to this discussion. We want to talk to leaders and academics, researchers, et cetera, that really understand perspectives on diversity in our city, as well as equity and inclusion. So today's program will connect all of those dots for sure. Like I said, we launched the program in June. We kicked it off with our inaugural speaker, Jim Schutz, a longtime Dallas journalist and author. He really gave us some historical context on race relations in Dallas, vis-a-vis the premise of his book called The Accommodation. Very interesting discussion in that program. And then, when we talk about the series, we'll be doing multiple formats. So today's format, as we all are participating, is on Zoom. But we have a format coming up in October that will involve a bus tour around some different sites to visit in Dallas that really highlight and spotlight the diversity in our city, and lots of different organizations that are playing a role in this DEI conversation and progress there. So we'll talk about that towards the end of the program. But today, I want to also recognize our sponsors. So many companies and organizations have stepped up to sponsor this series, which has really helped us make it a great series. We have 15 sponsors. So thank you so much to AECOM, to Encore, to HDR, Dallas College, UT Southwestern Medical Center, Jacobs Engineering, Coles and Thompson, Texas A&M Commerce, Children's Health, Polsinelli, Imprimis Staffing, HNTB, Reliant Energy, and WaFd Bank. So thank you to those organizations again for stepping up to sponsor so that we can put on a great series. So today I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Dr. CULLUM Clark, and also our moderator, Zakia Johnson. So let me start with a little bit of your bio, Dr. Clark, and thank you. I see you on the screen. Thanks for joining us. So Dr. J.H. CULLUM Clark is director of the Bush Institute, SMU Economic Growth Initiative, where he's responsible for managing various aspects of the new partnership between SMU's Department of Economics and the George W. Bush Presidential Center and Institute. He leads the initiative's work on domestic economic policy and economic growth, and has chief research interests at the macroeconomic policy level, economic geography, urban economics, and modern economic history. Many of you, in seeing the promotional materials for this program, learned that he will be talking about the North-South divide in Dallas, how it came about, giving us some context there. And I know this will be a rich discussion. Dr. Clark worked for 24 years in the investment industry prior to joining the academia, serving since 2002 as president of Prothero Clark Company, a Dallas investment firm. In addition to his time in the PhD program, his involvement with SMU also includes, since 2008, he's been on the university's investment committee. Since 2010, on the Tate Lecture Series Board of Directors. Tate Lectures are some of my favorite events to attend. And since 2017 as a Tower Center Fellow. He also serves on the boards of the Eugene McDermott Foundation and Uplift Education, and he's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Dallas Committee on Foreign Relations, and the Dallas Assembly. So welcome, Mr. Clark. Thank you so much for being here. Moderating today is Zakia Johnson. You can give us a wave from your screen, Zakia. She is with TI, and she is the manager of employee giving at TI on a global scale. She's been there for about 5.5 years. She has her bachelor's degree from my alma mater, University of North Texas, and her master's in public affairs from UTD. She serves on our chamber's board of directors and the executive committee. And Zakia, I know that you will have a rich conversation here with Dr. Clark. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Zakia, and Dr. Clark, and away we go.
Great. Thank you so much, Tina, for that amazing introduction. And thank you all for being here, especially you, Dr. Clark. We are super excited to hear your insights and just learn from you. So let's jump right into it. My first question for you is around infrastructure. What role has infrastructure such as highways played in dividing Dallas?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Zakia. And let me just, before answering the question, say to you and Tina and Ken and all of the North Dallas Chamber, thanks for having me. I'm honored to be with you. And I salute you all for creating a series on experiencing DEI. And I think it's really wise to call it experiencing, because we are all experiencing something that is challenging, sometimes unsettling, disorienting. And I think everyone who sort of takes seriously their role as a citizen, a business leader, and so forth, is wrestling with these things. And, the answers aren't always abundantly obvious either. So we're all kind of working towards it, some kind of better future as a society, and it's not easy. So good for you all to be a part of it and, bring your members along in this important discussion. So I'm thrilled to talk about the North-South divide and talk about the challenges in Southern Dallas. I have written about in various places some of the historical as well as economic factors that have given rise to this divide. So Zakia, we can talk about that in whatever order and whatever way you want. You asked about infrastructure, and I will answer that. I would like to, if it's okay, Zakia, could I say a couple things that maybe predated what I'm going to say about infrastructure?
You're learning from you. Take it away.
Okay. Well, I think just 2 or 3 things to highlight, and then I promise I will come into the infrastructure story. But just to try to understand, the Southern Dallas is, as many people will refer to it as the elephant in the room in the otherwise bright story of the DFW area's tremendous growth and prosperity. We have clearly evolved into a kind of donut-shaped economic geography with a kind of hole in Southern Dallas and in parts of Northern Dallas too, but particularly centered south of the Trinity River / I-30. And that is, I think people are starting to pay a lot more attention than they did for most of our history. People who don't live there, that is, and that is that's a really important bit of progress. But I think it's important to put into perspective what's happening, how we got here. What's happening? We're talking about one way of defining it that I did in a recent paper. Basically, the 9 southernmost city council districts. We're talking more than 800,000 people living in an area that's bigger than the city of Atlanta, an area that has seen extremely little new housing development, extremely little new commercial real estate development, a shrinkage in the total number of jobs ever since 2000, even though the population's gone somewhat upwards, that is economically essentially moribund. And meanwhile, we all know that the job growth, the really powerful job growth in the DFW area that's attracting people from all over the country is overwhelmingly far to the north of there, principally in the northern suburbs, which means really far from where people in southern Dallas live, particularly if they don't have a vehicle. In some ways, the situation's getting tougher, even though the discussion about how to address it is perhaps getting a little bit more urgent and a little smarter. How we came to this, before I would say infrastructure became a key driver, Zakia, I think that what we have to understand, first of all, that segregation on housing lines and so forth, schools and otherwise, was state policy. I think everybody understands that. Useful to point out that the city of Dallas was the first city in the state of Texas to impose racial housing segregation by law in 1916, and substantially all cities followed. Including ones in the north as well, by the way, in many cases. We need to understand that federal policy again and again reinforced segregation. It reinforced it in all kinds of ways that a lot of you all are probably aware of, but it just useful to recall when we talk about infrastructure. These days we're talking about passing an infrastructure bill that labels a lot of things infrastructure. So we can also say, we could say from the dawn of time when the federal government has gone and invested resources, in some sense, it's creating infrastructure, and it has created a segregated infrastructure. It did so in the 1930s in the New Deal era, when the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was the original federal agency involved in housing finance, became explicit about the desire to separate racial groups, when it literally created color-coded maps of cities, thereby giving rise to the term redlining. That was literally a red section on a map created by federal agency under the FDR administration. When the Housing Finance Agency, after it came into being, published guidelines on how cities should be implementing essentially mortgage federal housing finance initiatives with the explicit aim of separating racial groups, supporting the essentially, like, what was it, the code of ethics of the Realtor Administration, that basically said it is unethical for a realtor to do anything that furthers the racial integration of neighborhoods. And that was in the late 1940s, post-World War II. And that's where we come from. So now let's get into the more infrastructure and of course in Dallas, we did what everybody else did. I mean, Dallas was kind of normal in that respect. I think one thing that we sometimes forget, I was born in 1966, grew up in Dallas, and I think it is easy to forget these days that at the time I was born, Dallas was a lot more of a deep South city than we like to think of it today. I think culturally, policy-wise, politically, in many ways, it had a lot more in common with slightly smaller cities in Alabama and Mississippi than it had with Chicago or Philadelphia or the West Coast. I think times are kind of different now, but that's the reality of what we come from. So now when we talk about formal infrastructure in the classic sense of the term, right? The federal government undertook two really big initiatives starting at the end of the 40s, but then most notably with the the Interstate Highway Act. In which the federal government dramatically stepped up the dollars that it was pouring into American cities. One, of course, was the interstate highway system, and the other was essentially what was euphemistically called urban renewal. What urban renewal, that one's easier to deal with. What urban renewal meant, in fact, was that we were going to still further segregate people by essentially taking what were impoverished areas that typically were majority Black residents, not in every last case, demolish them because they were, maybe an eyesore to the better off people who were living not so far away, and in effect create new housing complexes, typically government-owned, government-controlled public housing complexes that were quite removed from where the better off people lived. And that went on all over America, including in Dallas. But it did have the effect of destroying what had been some pretty reasonably well-functioning neighborhoods. When I say reasonably well-functioning, poor, yes, but because so much discrimination and jobs and so forth. But at the same time, places that were in effect growing a kind of middle class, a Black middle class, and then increasingly as the Hispanic population grew, a Hispanic middle class as well. In a sense, I mean, I know at this point you all have probably become aware, for example, of the Greenwood district in Tulsa and the horrific massacre that happened in 1921. So we're aware of this idea of a kind of black downtown, a black Wall Street, as they called it there in Tulsa. We had our equivalents in Dallas. And they were, in a sense, dismantled and torn apart. In order to create a kind of different-looking area in the vicinity of downtown. The other giant initiative, of course, was the interstate highway system. The crucial decision was made not just to connect the country by highways, but to bring the highways right into traditional central business districts, i.e. that you could get to a downtown office tower on a big, fast highway from relatively far away, which obviously enabled cities to grow a lot further outwards. But it also raised the crucial question, where exactly do you build this highway that's going to run right into downtown? And not surprisingly, in Dallas and elsewhere, the highways overwhelmingly ran through what had been relatively low-income neighborhoods. I think it's sometimes argued that they literally built the highways where they did to try to isolate minority people. I'm not going to say that's not true, but I think it is more accurate to say, probably the most accurate explanation is they were going to build the highways, come hell or high water. And where are you going to build it? Where you're going to displace a whole lot of people from their homes? Well, it's a lot easier to build it where the people are politically powerless and of relatively low income. So not too surprising where it went. So what result did that have? Well, essentially it had a lot of results, but among other things, it literally cut neighborhoods in two, in many cases cut what became largely Black Southern Dallas. Later on, it became Black and Hispanic Southern Dallas. It cut it off in sometimes very physical ways from what maybe would have been like job centers, for example. So I am kind of a bicycling enthusiast. I had a little bit of a wipeout not long ago, so I haven't been on the bike as much, but I've biked all over the city of Dallas. And I can tell you this, it is a shock to see the following with your own eyes. And that is to bicycle into neighborhoods in Southern Dallas where the big highway bridges and overpasses and so on the highways are so densely put together that you come into a neighborhood and you literally can't figure out how the heck to get out of it. And that's, on a bicycle. Now, imagine when this was built, when a majority of the residents would not have had cars, right? And they're trying to actually get to any kind of workplace. How in the world is this actually going to work? That you're going to get out of this like strange triangle that's been completely enclosed with only very, kind of strange egress. Essentially this had the result of furthering segregation in every imaginable way, not just literally putting, for example, white and Black people on opposite sides of the track or the highway more likely, but it had the effect of removing the people who were kind of on the wrong side from opportunity and thereby hindering the whole subsequent development of the place. And so let me just conclude here, Zakia, this was a long-winded answer to your question. I promised to be shorter-winded on your subsequent questions, but I kind of had to give some historical context, didn't want to just lead with the 1950s. But if you look at, so I think how is this influencing the state of the North-South divide in Dallas today in 2021? I think it's very easy, and in the past it's been kind of commonplace to say, well, we demolished the housing projects, which were like a disastrous social economic experiment, and we ended explicit legally enforced racial segregation, and we did all these things. And so aren't we debating ancient history? Like, what does it have to do with today? And I'm here to tell you that it has a whole lot to do with today, at least in two very powerful ways. And I look forward to maybe the group or Zakia, you will want to explore other ways, and that's great. But I feel like I'm on really solid ground when I say it influenced the state of our city in two ways. Number one, it determined the economic geography and the demographic geography of our city. Where are the people today, right? Because when you spend 100+ years, in effect, separating people on the basis of race, and then there's a heavy economic overlay as well, you end up actually separating people on the basis of income as well. Well, it doesn't all just suddenly remix when you change the rules, right? You've created profoundly underinvested places. I mean, even if developers set out to build new types of housing in Southern Dallas today, what they'll very quickly find, to go back to the infrastructure point, is it's very hard to actually be code compliant. You can't, you don't have the water and the sewers and everything else is not in place. The sidewalks, there's all these things that don't exist because we never ever built them. So it determined where people are today, the patterns of which places are relatively well off and which places are not. That if you could spend 100 years randomly changing all the rules, and that still wouldn't go away. And the second is about wealth disparities, because people who were in the segregated low-income places, which overwhelmingly were on the southern side of our city, in countless ways did not have the opportunities to build generational wealth that more fortunate people had. It was hard to actually own a home at all when you can't access mortgage finance initially, because the federal government doesn't want you to access it, and then when the federal government sort of changes its tune, when the private banking sector maybe doesn't see the point in serving underserved areas, whatever their motivations, usually, kind of just classic business motivations, but if they don't see the point, they're kind of not going to do it. And so you wind up with, generation after generation of low home ownership, low home price appreciation until fairly recent times, by the way. We can come back to that. And this turns out to be really, really important. The not having wealth is a pretty big thing in America. We do not live in a Scandinavian cradle to grave welfare state. It's very, very hard to get ahead in life, or for your children to get ahead without some modicum of wealth. Some doesn't mean a whole lot of wealth, little, a home that you can borrow a little bit against to cover that last few dollars for a college education, countless other things. Small amount of wealth versus zero wealth makes a huge difference. And also what we know today is of all the wealth that is owned in America today, more than half of it was in some form inherited. So if people do not own a home, they're not very well going to be leaving that behind, right? And if they couldn't, borrow to start a business or borrow to get a college education, they're likely to be poorer when they die. So the young generation comes along without basically any access to wealth at all, including from their parents. Well, what happens if they're lucky enough to go to college at all? They wind up with a lot more debt, for example. And I could just go on and on about the countless ways that this historical legacy has shaped today. But Zakia, enough. What else do you want to talk about?
No, this is great. Thank you for setting up that historical context. There's so much I didn't even know, especially regarding some of those racial segregation policies that impacted the housing market here in Dallas. Thank you for sharing that. You mentioned how is this relevant today? So I kind of want to shift into the present, right? It's obvious that so much has impacted right now. So what can we do as a business community? What can the North Dallas Chamber do to really promote that economic inclusiveness?
Sure. Well, I think, what was it? I think Boone Pickens at some point in some talk that I heard him give, he was always very quotable. And he said something like he would, he'd trust a person, like a not terribly bright person with a plan more than a genius with no plan at all. You kind of have to have a plan. You have to have a kind of a mental construct of what does it mean to address the divide? What does it mean to bring greater economic prosperity and opportunity to the southern part of our city? And I think there's a lot of, I think we live in a time when there's all this reckoning around our tragic history and about so many other aspects of what we've just been talking about. So there's a lot of sense of, we've got to just air a lot of problems. We need to just air how we feel about it. And I get it. I totally get it. But there comes a time when we need to actually be having a conversation about what is the construct? What is the plan or the concept that creates more prosperity in Southern Dallas and places like it all over our country? So let me suggest just a few simple propositions. And then I think that they imply what business community can do, what educational institutions can do, what city government can do. Everyone has a role to play in all this. But let me just say a few. I've got kind of a 5 point, I hate to say 5 point plan. That sounds like I'm running for something, which thank goodness I'm not. But 5 points that I think hopefully are relevant, maybe spark more conversation. Okay, number one, education in every sense of the word is utterly central. Okay. There's no economic development of a place that does not involve raising the educational attainment level of its people. We live in a knowledge-centric economy, and economists know well that if you tell me the educational attainment level, the levels of a place, of a city, a town, a neighborhood, et cetera, I can pretty well tell you the income levels. It's like clockwork. Okay. Generally speaking, education works in America. We've got a lot of angst around higher ed. I get it. I can talk about that. But generally speaking, education works. People have a lot more ability to contribute to the economy, and they have a lot higher income the more educated they are. And so everything we do on that front, it's hard work. I see my friend Libby McCabe is out there, and she's in the middle of it. I'm in the middle of it in some other ways. I'm sure a great many of you are. We have to stay at that hard work, and I think it goes over into the higher ed world too. But we can talk more about that. There's a lot we can do, I think, to make the higher education institutions of our city more powerful engines of upward mobility than they already are, particularly for people living in the southern part of our city. Second point, we need a dramatic improvement in the supply and affordability of housing of all kinds. Okay. Southern Dallas is desperately deprived on that score. How do I know that? I know that very little is being built, but I also look at prices. As we've seen price levels go up for housing all over our city, all over the region, all over the country, where are the fastest growth rates in prices in percentage terms? They're actually in the lowest income parts of our city, which is a stunning fact, right? It's not like the incomes of the people living in those neighborhoods have gone up so much, generally not much at all. What it reflects is supply versus demand. The supply growth is just lousy in Southern Dallas, and we need to do a lot better on that front. That's a big undertaking too. That involves, I think, significant changes to what is frankly a not very functional whole development process all around. Like some of y'all are maybe in the home building industry. I've just had lunch with my good friend who's full-time in the low-income housing tax credit funded affordable housing industry. He says the city of Dallas is totally impossible to deal with. He's largely given up. He mostly deals in suburban places and other cities elsewhere in the state. And that's just a common refrain. But there's other things we got to get past. It's not just that the systems don't work very well, even though there's some really smart officials in the city of Dallas trying to address it. We got to get this done. But there's also, I'd say, in some cases, there's just what I would call, frankly, bad ideas, and we got to throw the bad ideas out the window. Here's one bad idea. One bad idea is that, okay, it starts from a good idea, which is that it's a bad thing to create a concentration of low-income people in one place, far from any job center. Okay, that is for sure a bad idea. But a good idea, or it's a good idea that we shouldn't be doing that. Okay, I know a little bit of a double negative there, but our city government has made an inference. They've made an intellectual leap to another idea that I think has caused us a lot of trouble, and that is the idea that the city of Dallas, which controls the availability of funding for affordable housing, okay, for subsidized housing, that the city of Dallas is not going to permit much anything in the way of new housing development in the southern part of our city, because that might have the effect of concentrating poverty. Well, the net result of that is if it's really expensive and really hard for countless reasons to build new affordable housing in the wealthiest parts of the city, and the city government won't allow it in the lower income parts of the city, the net result is you don't build it anywhere. And that's what we're seeing right now. And there is no bright future in southern Dallas, in my opinion, that does not involve a lot of new housing of all kinds, at all up and down the income spectrum, including at the subsidized affordable level. Third basic point is we need aggressive investment in quality of life of all kinds. Why is this? Because no place can possibly thrive if people who have choices won't choose to live there. If the young people growing up there are always told, if you work hard enough, you can get out. And then, of course, they do get out if they possibly can. That can't. There's no turnaround that doesn't involve getting past that. So what does it mean to do quality of life? I mean, everyone's got their own definition. I will say, being a student of the literature on this, I would just throw out three things: outdoor amenities of all kinds, parks, trails, um, every kind of green space that just makes the place prettier, a more pleasant place to be outside. It's not hard if you travel around Southern Dallas to realize that there's a gigantic amenity disparity between the better off parts of the city and the less well off parts of the city. Walkable urban places. There's a vast growing economic literature that says interesting, diverse, walkable places. I don't mean turning all of Southern Dallas into like something with the density of Manhattan or Brooklyn. It's never going to happen. But I mean that there's a significant number of like nodes out there, places that are concentrations of activity, hopefully multiple uses, some people living nearby, different kinds of businesses nearby, different kinds of fun things to do nearby, restaurants and coffee shops and everything else, all in relatively close proximity to each other that you can walk from point A to point B and actually get to some place that you'd actually want to go. When those get built, in general, the market shows they work. People want to be there. The values go up. So that's an important part of creating more quality of life. And safety. I'm no expert on public safety, but you got to have it. And I'll just leave it at that. There is no path forward where people don't fundamentally feel safe. Fourth point is I would argue that prosperity and wealth creation are something that happen in a very hyper-local way, i.e. they happen in very particular locations. And then they tend to radiate outwards from that location because of something that we economists call agglomeration economies. That is the benefits, the improved productivity, improved innovativeness that happens when people and businesses and ideas are in close proximity to one another. So what I would argue is that in Southern Dallas, it so happens that we have an extreme shortage of good private sector business nodes of prosperity, but we do actually have some pretty good anchor institutions in the higher ed and healthcare world and in certain other categories. So I think of UT Dallas and Paul Quinn, think of Methodist Hospital and the veteran and the VA hospital. And I think of Redbird as an emerging more job center and healthcare center before long than Mall. And where, full disclosure, I've invested in Peter Brodsky's deal, and I think he's doing a brilliant job and with a very, very important initiative here in Dallas. I take the view that the best hope of prosperity spreading in Southern Dallas is if it spreads outwards from those nodes, maybe from a heavily improved Fair Park as well. So I would be very much focusing on those places. And fifth point, for a place to be prosperous, it needs to be accessible, physically accessible, digitally accessible. People have to be able to connect to the darn internet, you know. It needs to feel welcoming. It needs to be reasonably affordable. I've talked about housing, but accessible. The digital divide turns out to be a big deal. We also know that in Southern Dallas and in other urban, relatively low-income locations, that it's not primarily the shortage of the actual cable in the ground that keeps people from accessing, digital resources and so forth. On the whole, the cables are in the ground in urban areas, sometimes not in lower-income rural areas. Different problem. It's basically a problem of affordability. And this is a challenge we got to figure out as a society, and maybe city government can have something to do with it. Certainly the business community can have something to do with it, which is to say that there need to be affordable bundles, and probably they need to be subsidized. So those things are what I would say need to happen. That suggests a role for everyone. You know, city government has a crucial role to play in improving the process that can make it easier to build more homes. They have a crucial role to play in directing infrastructure dollars, and including what probably will be a significant flow of federal infrastructure dollars. I would argue that city government needs to actually figure out how to be a lot smarter and more intentional about what gets developed where. It needs to be more of a partner to the private sector. I don't think the public sector in Dallas will succeed in being a real estate developer on its own, but in partnership with the private sector, it can make a big difference. Business community, everyone out there in your organization who is a real estate developer or investor of any kind, there's enormous opportunity in Southern Dallas if we can get this right. There's all kinds of things that need to get built. I think it'd be exciting if I knew how to build real estate and I was younger, to try to make a career out of, at least part of my career, out of building the many things that need to be built, and understanding that when good things get built, people do in fact come. I think that any business making any kind of site decision, like for example, a retailer, or a restaurant or whatever, I think it'd be really useful if people, if anyone who's doing that maybe makes a fresh study of Southern Dallas. One thing thing Peter Brodsky has told me, because he obviously knows the demographics and the numbers around Redbird really, really well. He says one thing he's found again and again is when he says to businesses, you ought to set up your grocery store or your whatever restaurant here on Redbird. They'll say, no, there's not enough income. We won't make money. Then he shows them the statistics, said that's false. You just aren't right on the numbers. You're operating from old prejudices. Actually, there's it's not a rich neighborhood, but there's income enough. Plus, it's right next to the Dallas border with, I think it's Cedar Hill across the way, when income levels are higher. So, look again is what I would say. And then finally, I think, a couple other things. Every business employs people, and every time you make decisions about people, you're creating opportunity, right? Create opportunity for more people. I mean, think about how to invite more people into applying for jobs in your company and how to bring them along. That's a giant topic. My eyes have been open more than they were before, to be totally honest, in the last year and a half. And we're all trying to learn on that. And finally, I think the Dallas business community as a whole, including in North Dallas, needs to have a stronger voice, as it once did. Long ago, as a relatively unified voice saying, we've got to deal with this. We as a city, it needs to become the most powerful pressure point on city government, saying, this will finally sink us if we don't address this challenge. So those are things I think you can do.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you for touching on those points. And I'm sure everyone's, been thinking as you've been sharing some of the challenges and impacts, what can we do? This is a very diverse audience of leaders from the business community, the education community. So thank you so much for being very thoughtful in those responses. I do see in the chat there have been a lot of questions and a lot of great conversation going on, Dr. Clark. So we will want to touch on those. Ken, let me know, should we go ahead and transition into audience questions, or did you think we had time for one more question?
I would suggest one more question. And I think that the one that you and I have been corresponding on would be very appropriate.
Okay, perfect. So this next question is a two-part question, Dr. Clark. How does our current system of city government 14-1 representation impact economic division? So that's part one. And then part two is, have things improved or worsened since we shifted our government structure?
Great. It's a great question, profound question. I think Ken and I have maybe talked about that a little privately. Yeah, I am increasingly convinced that the structure of our government is not well suited to the challenges that we face. Let's say a quick bit on the second part of your question, Zakia, about the history, and then really talk about the present. I recall when we had the Citizens Charter Commission and so forth, and initially had the idea of going from all at-large seats to 10-4-1. My mother was an editorial writer at that time. She actually wrote in favor of that. We got all kinds of angry letters from every imaginable political direction. In the end, the city moved to 14-1. I think historically, at that moment in time, that needed to happen. I think there was an understanding that if everything is, one mayor elected at large and then 14 individual districts, that you probably were going to tend towards a system where there were 14 people looking out for their own relatively small corner of the city and not so much taking the big view. And that was a minus. But on the other hand, our system had not been very democratic. It disenfranchised too many people. It was a democratic age. It's still a democratic age. We needed to democratize the system. In some political sense, needed to happen. Okay. Now we live with the good and the bad. The good, our system is actually fairly democratic and responsive. I would generally say that on the whole, the city council more or less does it one person by person. They pretty much vote like their constituents want them to vote. So what we get is, in some sense, the aggregation up of all kinds of neighborhood preferences. This is probably true, but we do lose something pretty important. Okay, we do lose in some sense, the ability to take the big picture, take the big view of what the city needs, and frankly, to get things done. This is not an efficient system for getting things done. It's very easy when you observe what seems to be a lot of dysfunction. I brought up like the development process for new homes. I could bring up all these other areas. It's very easy to look at it and say, it must be we don't have the right people. If only we could elect the better people, right? And I don't think that's, I think we've been going too long with this system to accept that explanation. In fact, I've known a lot of the people, as a lot of you all probably have, and on the whole, I generally think we've had a lot of really good people. I think we've been pretty blessed, frankly, with the whole string of mayors, my whole lifetime, frankly. We generally speaking had people who were kind of public spirited and intelligent and meant well. So I think it's the system we've set in place. We have set in place, first of all, a system with a very weak mayor in terms of the powers in the mayor's office. There are other cities like Houston, for example, where I know of a number of things that have actually happened. They happened because, Mayor Sylvester Turner ran on it, promised it to people, got into office and had the power to do it. He directed that it be done and it happened. We do not have that. Yes, we put a fair bit of power in the hands of the city manager, but the city manager in some sense is hemmed in so many ways, answerable to these 15 people, in a sense, forced into the role of being kind of a, sort of fix the potholes kind of job, as opposed to a take the big picture on what needs to be done. So I think what we've wound up with is a system that kind of empowers the 14 each within their district, but paralyzes the city from solving basic problems. I personally would support a stronger mayor system. And I think a second thing I would support that's very much actively in discussion now is greater delegation of authority to entities that are ultimately accountable, but have a certain amount of operational autonomy. So for example, Dr. Eric Anthony Johnson, who heads economic development and housing within the city government, has written a policy paper that advocates for a separate freestanding economic development organization. So an entity that would have a board constituted by city government, answerable to the city, but with a CEO who might actually be able to stick around for a while and have some clarity of purpose at the level of the whole city. So I think we probably need that in the housing space as well. Maybe it's one entity, could do both. But yeah, we've created a situation, a system in which things do not get done. Everyone who works in City Hall will tell you that. I guarantee to each of you, go meet the smartest person you can find in the City Hall, and you'll come away with two thoughts. One is they're really smart. That person has a lot of really good ideas. And number two, they can't get any of their ideas forward, or at least not nearly to the degree that they should be. And so, that's a failure of the system. And we need an active discussion of that.
Thank you so much for answering that question, Dr. Clark. I think now we're going to go ahead and shift into a few questions from the audience. So I'm going to pitch it back over to you, Ken.
Great. Thank you, Zakia. I actually had a question for you, CULLUM, that is kind of the $64,000 question that is posed to every Politico. And I'd like to hear it from your perspective, your answer to this question. And that is, gentrification brings more tax revenue to the city, but at the same time, it displaces longtime residents of a community, of the urban core particularly. How do we balance those seemingly incongruent objectives?
Well, that's a great question, Ken, and something we're, I think, clearly in our city and all big American cities really wrestling with a lot. Okay, first thing to say is that I think there's a lot of fear out there over gentrification and displacement, and the fear has become paralyzing to us. Okay, I absolutely do not diminish the challenge in particular neighborhoods when values go up a lot, the tax bill goes up a lot, or the rent, what have you. I think it's a grade A housing affordability crisis, and certainly one factor that fuels it is when higher income people move into neighborhoods that have heretofore been mostly occupied by lower income residents. This is true. But in the grand scheme of American cities, okay, Dallas has actually had, as plenty of economists have shown, lots of studies, considerably less actual displacement than most cities. And actually, I would argue that if we take the entirety of Southern Dallas and the other relatively low income parts of our city, if you basically say, has the main problem been too little capital coming in or too much in a way that results in rapid change and displacement of people? I would say too little capital is the larger problem in a much, much larger percentage of the lower income parts of our city than too much capital. Now, let me talk about how to actually think about, at least as I think about going forward. So there was some of you all know, great author, Jane Jacobs, thought by many to be the greatest American writer ever on cities. And she wrote a famous book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, in 1961, still as relevant 50 years later as it was when she wrote it. And she said there is a tendency in neighborhoods for one of two things to happen at any point in time, either for no capital to come into a neighborhood and for it just to decay and deteriorate, or for what she called a catastrophic flood of capital to come into a neighborhood and sweep everything before it and completely change everything. Just 100% displacement of the people who were already there. She observed that in 1961. And she said, cities have to somehow fight this binary outcome. And we all of us who are in the business world, I mean, I have a lot of years in the investment world. I understand why this is so. Any of us who've ever invested in real estate deals will know that at any point in time, there's like a certain kind of deal that it pencils out a certain way. And generally speaking, it either works or it doesn't work for private capital. And if one such deal in a neighborhood works, probably lots of such deals work in a neighborhood. And it's easy to see how the private sector, which has nearly infinite access to capital when it comes to building new homes, new real estate, might, a nearly infinite amount of capital can flood into a place if the deals work, right? It's easy to see. But I think that we head for a dark future if we accept that there's only those two binary outcomes in all of our neighborhoods in Southern Dallas. I think that I'm a big fan of, private sector market solutions, limited government, believe me. And I don't think there's any solution to any of our significant challenges around economic development in Dallas that aren't centered on a robust private sector, business community thriving. However, I think there is a role for city government to be a lot more intentional about what it wants to see in particular places. And what I would ask the city government to do is to address this gentrification issue, is to move pretty sharply towards a system that basically throws the doors wide open and basically says, we're open for business in terms of the message to the private sector. Let's do a lot of new development here. But at the same time, puts up guardrails. There's lots of tools that have been explored all over the country. We have virtually none of them in place right now. They can involve tax freezes for existing owners. They can involve historic preservation. They can involve a lot of things that keep most of the residents in a neighborhood, even as it changes. None of these are perfect. And it's hard to achieve that mixed income neighborhood nirvana, it's hard, but we got to at least try, and we could probably achieve some success at it, i.e. bring new capital into neighborhoods that have seen too little capital, and at the same time, create a degree of stability for the people already there. We could do a heck of a lot better than we've been doing, and I think we've got to try.
Great. I noticed, Zakia, if you don't mind, I noticed that Harsh Agarwal, board member representing Alliance Bernstein, has a question in the chat. So Harsh, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you, Ken, and thank you, Colin, for the insight. I think the last point you were making about influx of capital, I believe that the Southern Dallas has a larger proportion of opportunity zones as defined by the previous administration's Tax Cut and Reform Act. From your data set and your viewpoint, what has been the impact of the opportunity zones in the Southern Dallas, or what needs to happen, what needs to change? Because that has been an effective tool in various other cities to bring the capital in.
Well, thank you for your question. That's a great question. And nice to meet you, Harsh. I think the evidence right now, let me tell you the evidence, and then I think where the discussion is on opportunity zones. I think the evidence nationally and in Dallas has been that the effect has been greater than zero, but small. I think that's the reality right now. Why would it be greater than zero? It's a pretty sweet incentive, and it ought to induce a certain amount of capital to do things that it wouldn't otherwise do. However, at the same time, why has it probably been small? I think one factor is that just the structure of the deal. It can take as many real estate people have oftentimes said, it can take a good deal and make it into a really good deal. It can't make a bad deal into a good deal. And I could explore the the math around that, but that's the truth. That's what all experts say. And there's just there's a whole lot of bad deals in low income places that they aren't going to be converted to good deals. I mean, when I say bad deal, meaning it's not going to work for the private sector without some kind of additional benefit, and this particular structure doesn't get you there. So I think the effect has been kind of small. And where things have been done, I think most are things that probably would have happened anyway, to be frank. But it's impossible to have the perfectly designed public policy, and some have happened that wouldn't have happened otherwise. I think in Dallas, you can probably count them on one hand. So I'm glad we had it versus not having it. Now, there is an active discussion of this in DC right now, Harsh, because well, first of all, the Democrats are in charge of both houses of Congress and the administration, and never really, frankly, liked the Opportunity Zone program too much because, well, one, the idea that it would, in a sense, be a tax break for the very wealthy, you can debate whether that's a good way to do economic development or not. I've stated my piece. I thought it was probably marginally a good idea. And secondly, I think because it wasn't very targeted in the kind of investments that needed to happen. So like critics might say, who tend to be on the left side of the aisle, might say, if there's some neighborhood in some city that is kind of struggling, but actually like within the neighborhood that's the Opportunity Zone, part of it is downtown and it's actually okay, and someone builds a Ritz-Carlton, like, really, is that what we wanted? Was that the intention? Well, maybe the Ritz-Carlton's a good thing. Maybe it'll employ more people, right? But it's debatable, but all I'm saying is it's a little bit unpopular. It's a bit on the rocks. They may or may not try to, change it in a potential tax legislation that we might see before the end of the year. So we'll watch that space. Personally, if I was the dictator, I would keep it. I would expand it. I'd say to all qualified geographies rather than the ones that happen to be selected during a momentary frenzy in early 2018 or whatever it was. I would, probably, essentially make it more widely available in more geography and to more types of investors, but also maybe give cities the ability to put a little bit of restriction around what actually gets built. Like, to qualify, you can still build whatever you're going to build, but to qualify, it's got to be a little bit more public purpose. That's what I would do.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cullum. One last question before we move on, but before we do, I want to highlight Tina's comments in the introduction about our next program in this series, which will be our Experiencing DEI bus tour of the Southern sector. And it's interesting because Cullum has mentioned Peter Brodsky and Redbird Mall. Peter will be addressing us on that tour. He's mentioned UNT Dallas. Bob Mong, their president, is going to be addressing us on that tour. And he also mentioned Paul Quinn College, and Michael Sorrell, their president, will be addressing us. And we'll be visiting many other sites within the southern part of Dallas during that day. So hopefully you'll be able to join us. But we have a question from Michael Martin about a specific innovation center. Michael, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot, Ken. Dr. Clark, thanks for your comments today. Are you familiar with the new 4315 Innovation Center by the VA? They just had a big media event and kind of a ribbon cutting of sorts today. Do you know about the facility?
I've heard of it, but I've not been yet. I'd love to know more.
Okay. Well, my point in my note is it's bringing in impact-oriented businesses, Dallas College, UNT, the Regional Black Contractors Association, et cetera. And I'm just curious if you think that kind of model, because it's real, it's happening. People are moving in there right down the street from the VA on Lancaster. Is that the kind of model you think we should replicate or work? Well, we don't have track record yet, but I'm just curious what you know about it, what you think about it.
Yes.
From what you know, what I've described. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. I'm thrilled. I hope we have a lot more of this. I will, on your recommendation, Michael, and please call me Cullum, I will go over and see it. I preach all the time. We need to create more of exactly this. We need to create centers of business that are, like I mentioned earlier, radiating out from natural wealth creation centers, natural anchor institutions. The best anchors around in Dallas, I already mentioned, but you just in the chat noted Dallas College and University of North Texas at Dallas. So there's two great ones. And the idea that something might be, in a sense, an outgrowth or a neighbor of, or in some sense, within a reasonable distance of a higher ed institution. I'm a somewhat qualified, but still raging bull on what higher ed can do for our city. Somewhat qualified because there's issues of financial sustainability, and there are other issues around higher ed, we all know. But nonetheless, I think UNT Dallas and Paul Quinn are doing really, really important work. We need for them to grow. We need for the number of students passing through and persisting and graduating to go up a long, long ways. But also they are knowledge generating institutions, not just in their students, but in all kinds of ways. And we need that to spill over to the business world, kind of across the street, as it were. So I love anything that is, a maker space or, small business center near a university. I love an innovation district near UT Southwestern. And anything that basically creates more bridges from sort of knowledge generation to actual business creation, business growth, job creation. And in North Texas, we've mostly been kind of good at this. We just have to figure out how to be good at it in Southern Dallas.
Great. Thank you, Cullum, very much. We can't thank you enough for being here today. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Kittner, our Chief Operating Officer, to close us out today. So Jeff.
And Ken, can I just say real fast, really honored to be with you. So excited about what you're doing. And I forgot to mention it before, but the bus tour is a brilliant idea. So thank you for having me. I was really honored to be with you, Ken.
Well, we do have a really engaged DEI task force, and they're the ones that came up with the idea. And we're really pleased with the opportunity to be able to provide that. And by the way, Cullum, we were just talking about this during a lunch meeting today. The reaction from all of these leaders in Southern Dallas has just been so incredibly positive. And so we're really looking forward to the opportunity to connect with all of them. And, but again, we're also very thankful for your presence today, Cullum. You've really helped us bridge between Jim Schutz and his perspectives from 1987 to today, and showing us the current realities of today and how we got here. So thanks
to Zakia
much.
Too.
Yeah, well, Zakia, obviously the masterful moderator that she always is. So, yeah, Jeff, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's fine.
Take it away.
Thanks, Ken. And thank you again to CULLUM and Zakia for this outstanding and robust discussion today. We really appreciate you both being here. CULLUM, in your honor, will be making a donation at the end of our fiscal year to the Ostrom Street Center in your name. Thanks again. Yeah, thank you again. Thanks to all of our sponsors for this program, our gold sponsors, AECOM, Dallas College, Market Wave, HDR, Encore, Texas A&M Commerce, Coles and Thompson, Jacobs, and UT Southwestern. And our silver sponsors, Children's Health, HNTB, Imprimis, Polsinelli, Reliant, and WaFd Bank. I see many of our sponsor representatives on this call, and thank you all for being here today. As Ken and Cullum have both referenced, we're really excited about our next program in this series on October 13th, starting at 9:30 a.m. It's our Bridging the Divide bus tour. We'll start at North Park Center, and we've got buses, and we'll be heading to Southern Dallas. Our stops so far that we've confirmed are Park South YMCA, the Dallas Black Chamber of Commerce, Paul Quinn College, UNT Dallas, Trinity Forest, Joppy area, Singing Hills Rec Center, Redbird Mall, and Bonton Farms, which is where we'll be having lunch. Our speakers include Peter Brodsky, Michael Sorrell, Bob Mong, Harrison Blair, who's the CEO of the Black Chamber, Darren Babcock with Bonton Farms, and many more. So please sign up for that. Space is limited. I put a link in the chat. We hope that you will consider joining us for that event. You may also be aware that we had previously scheduled our annual meeting with Lucy Billingsley as our speaker for September 17th. We have pushed the date on that into November, and the new date will be November 16th at the Hilton Hamilton. We pushed it based on guidance from our hospital and county partners and sponsors to push that back by 2 months because of the surge. So you can get more information about that and all of our programming at ndcc.org. Hope to see you all again soon for another program in this series on the 13th in person. And with that, we are adjourned.